The protagonist, a retired drill sergeant, moves to a quiet neighborhood with his wife and disabled daughter, Emma, who has cerebral palsy. They hope for a peaceful life, but Emma quickly becomes a target for bullying. The bully, Jake, is the son of Karen, the powerful and entitled HOA president, who encourages his cruel behavior. Watch the full video to see how the HOA family's downfall unfolds. At first, the bullying was small but hurtful. Jake would make jokes about Emma's wheelchair, pretending to feel sorry for her, but his words were full of mockery. "Better hope your battery doesn't die or you're stuck here forever," he'd say, laughing with his friends. Emma would smile back, not letting them see how much it stung, but deep inside, her heart would sink every time. She tried to stay strong, pretending it didn't bother her. But as days went by, the bullying grew worse. Jake spread cruel rumors around school, whispering that Emma only got good grades because her teachers felt bad for her. Emma overheard these whispers in the hallways, and each one felt like a blow to her confidence. Then came the physical harassment. Jake and his friends would bump into her wheelchair on purpose, just enough to make her struggle to keep her balance but not enough to get caught. The worst moment came one afternoon at lunch. Jake snuck up behind Emma and stuffed gum into the wheels of her chair. As Emma tried to roll forward, the chair stuck. The more she tried to move, the more embarrassed she felt. The laughter from Jake and his friends echoed in her ears. "Guess you need a real upgrade, huh?" he mocked. Emma clenched her jaw, trying not to let them see her hurt. Later that night, when she told her parents, she brushed it off like it was no big deal. But her hands trembled and her eyes were filled with pain. The bullying was wearing her down, and though she kept fighting it, the emotional toll was becoming harder to hide. It all came to a head one afternoon after school. Emma was waiting for her ride outside the school gates, her wheelchair parked by the sidewalk as she waited for her dad. Her best friend, Lily, was with her, chatting about their plans for the weekend. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the empty parking lot. It was supposed to be a peaceful moment, until Jake showed up. Jake, with his usual pack of friends trailing behind him, spotted Emma sitting alone, and a wicked grin spread across his face. For weeks he had been pushing her buttons, but today something in him snapped. He had seen how Emma had refused to break. She hadn't cried, hadn't given him the satisfaction of seeing her upset. Now he was determined to force a reaction. Without warning, Jake grabbed the handles of Emma's wheelchair, jerking them backward, lifting the front wheels off the ground. Emma's heart skipped a beat as she felt her body shift dangerously. Her arms flailed, trying to keep herself steady, but it was no use. She couldn't balance herself. "Want to race, Emma?" Jake taunted, grinning like a predator playing with its prey. His friends laughed, watching as Emma struggled to keep herself upright, her eyes wide with terror. Lily stepped forward, trying to stop them, but Jake shoved her out of the way. Emma's stomach lurched as she was tilted at an impossible angle, her face twisting in panic. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't fight back. The world seemed to slow as Jake held her there for what felt like forever. Then, with a cruel smirk, he let go. The wheelchair slammed back onto all four wheels and Emma was thrown forward. The force of the fall made her stomach churn, and the impact shot pain up her spine. She hit the ground hard, her palms scraping the rough pavement as she tried to push herself up. She gasped, her breath sharp as her body trembled from the shock. Her head spun, her arms aching from the sudden movement. Lily was beside her in an instant, but Emma barely noticed. All she could focus on was the sharp pain in her side and the sting of humiliation that washed over her. Jake and his friends just stood there, laughing, enjoying her suffering. "Look at you, Emma," Jake sneered. "Guess you can't even stay upright." He kicked her wheelchair away, sending it rolling down the pavement, out of reach. Emma didn't move. Her pride was broken, and her heart felt like it was shattering in her chest. But it wasn't just Emma who was hurting. Emma's father, who had been waiting in his car, saw everything unfold from a distance. He watched his daughter fall and something inside him snapped. The calm, disciplined man who had been a drill sergeant for years felt an unfamiliar fire building inside him. A raw, uncontrollable rage. He could feel the anger rising in his chest, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He was trained to stay calm in the worst situations, but this was different. This wasn't just some mission. This was his daughter, the girl he had promised to protect, the girl who had never hurt anyone in her life. The injustice of it all hit him like a punch to the gut. Without thinking, he stormed toward Jake and his friends, his heart pounding in his chest, but he stopped just short of them. He could see Emma on the ground, struggling to get up. She was trying so hard to be brave, but the weight of the bullying had finally crushed her spirit. Her father knelt beside her, gently helping her into her chair. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice trembling with the fury he was trying so hard to control. Emma looked up at him, her eyes filled with unshed tears. She nodded, but her face was pale. She didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. She was broken. This wasn't over. Jake had pushed too far, and now the father was ready to fight back, not just for his daughter but for justice. The moment had come. Jake and his family would pay for what they had done. The moment Jake flipped Emma's wheelchair, something inside the father snapped. He had always been calm, always in control, but watching his daughter fall, helpless and humiliated, brought out a side of him he had kept buried for years. His training as a drill sergeant had taught him to stay calm under pressure, to think before acting. But this was different. This was personal. After helping Emma get back into her wheelchair, he stood up and took a deep breath. His hands were trembling with rage, but his face was stone cold. He had spent his life fighting battles in war zones, facing threats without flinching, but nothing had ever made him feel this kind of fury. He walked toward Karen's house, each step heavy with purpose. He had already made up his mind that this would be the end of Jake's bullying and Karen's reign over the neighborhood. The entire block had witnessed the way she allowed her son to torment a disabled girl, and now it was time for her to face the consequences. When he reached Karen's front door, he didn't knock. Instead, he pounded on it with the kind of force that made the door rattle. Seconds later, Richard, Jake's father, opened the door, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the man standing before him. "What do you want?" Richard sneered, clearly annoyed. The father didn't respond at first. His gaze shifted past Richard, landing on Karen, who stood at the end of the hallway, arms crossed, wearing that smug smile she always had. He could feel his blood boil, but he kept his voice steady. "We need to talk," he said calmly, but his words carried weight. There was no hint of hesitation or fear in his tone. Karen and her husband exchanged a glance, but neither of them seemed ready for what was coming. "What's this about?" Karen asked, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Your son," the father said, his voice calm but with a dangerous edge, "attacked my daughter today. He flipped her wheelchair, hurt her, humiliated her in front of everyone. And I'm not going to let that slide." Karen raised an eyebrow, clearly unfazed. "Boys will be boys," she said dismissively, stepping forward to stand next to her husband. "Maybe if your daughter wasn't so fragile, she wouldn't be such an easy target." The father's jaw clenched. He wanted to shout, to lash out at the woman who had just belittled his daughter, but he held back. He had faced much worse in his years of service, and he wasn't going to let Karen's arrogance get to him. "You're wrong," he said, his voice low and controlled. "My daughter is stronger than anyone you'll ever know. But you, Karen, you are nothing but a bully hiding behind your HOA title." Karen sneered. "And what are you going to do about it? I don't think you're in any position to make demands." The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Karen tried to stand tall, but the father's calm confidence only seemed to make her more uncomfortable. He was a man used to controlling situations, used to taking charge, and Karen knew she couldn't intimidate him. "I'm done being polite," the father said, his voice ice cold. "If you ever come near my daughter again, if you even think about hurting her, you will regret it. And I'll make sure everyone in this neighborhood knows who you really are." Karen opened her mouth to retort, but the words seemed to die in her throat. Richard shifted uncomfortably, clearly not used to being on the defensive. The father took one last step toward Karen, towering over her, making sure she understood the gravity of what he was saying. "I'm not asking. I'm telling you." And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving Karen and Richard standing there speechless. Karen's arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by something closer to fear. The father knew this wasn't the end. Karen wouldn't back down so easily. But this confrontation had shaken her. And for the first time the tables had turned. After the confrontation with Karen, the protagonist knew he had to do more than just stand up to her. She had been bullying his family, abusing her position as the HOA president, and causing trouble for too long. He couldn't let her get away with it any longer. He spent days digging into Karen's past, looking for any sign of wrongdoing. It wasn't easy. Karen had been careful, covering her tracks, making sure no one suspected her of anything. But the protagonist wasn't about to back down. He had years of experience in uncovering lies, and he was determined to find the truth. As he investigated, he started uncovering evidence that Karen had been using her position to line her pockets. She had been accepting bribes from contractors, inflating repair costs, and pocketing the extra money. She had even been misusing HOA funds for her own personal gain, making sure to keep everything hidden from the community. The deeper he dug, the more he found, and the more disgusted he became with Karen's abuse of power. The more he learned, the more determined he became to expose her for who she really was. He knew he couldn't just confront her alone anymore. He needed to show the whole neighborhood what kind of person Karen really was. The perfect opportunity came when the next HOA meeting was announced. It was time to bring the truth to light. On the night of the meeting, the atmosphere was electric. The usual group of homeowners filed into the meeting room, but there was a noticeable tension in the air. The protagonist had made sure to gather everything: receipts, emails, photos, and even testimony from former HOA members who had witnessed Karen's shady dealings firsthand. He had it all, and he was ready to expose it. As the meeting began, Karen walked in with her usual smug smile, ready to lead the room and brush off any concerns that came her way. But the protagonist wasn't intimidated. He stood up when the time was right, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing inside him. "I have something important to share with the community," he said, his voice steady but firm. The room fell silent. The other homeowners turned to look at him, curious about what was going on. With one swift motion he hit play on his laptop and the screen flickered to life. The room gasped as the first set of documents appeared on the screen. Bank transactions, invoices for repairs that were never completed, and payments made to fake contractors. People murmured in disbelief as the evidence stacked up before their eyes. But that wasn't the worst of it. The protagonist clicked to the next slide, and the audience went quiet as Karen's true face was revealed. He showed screenshots of Karen's emails where she'd pressured vendors for kickbacks, ordered unnecessary repairs, and ignored legitimate requests from residents who needed help. There were even clips from HOA meetings where she had laughed about her control over the neighborhood, mocking anyone who dared to challenge her. Karen's face went pale as the room erupted in whispers and murmurs. The very community she had tried to control for so long was now turning against her. She stood up, her hands shaking with rage, trying to regain some control over the room. "This is all lies," she shouted, but no one was listening. The truth was out and there was no denying it. One by one the neighbors began to speak up, asking questions, demanding answers. The room was filled with anger and disbelief as they realized how much Karen had stolen from them, how she had manipulated them all for years. The final blow came when the protagonist stood up once more, his voice calm but unwavering. "This is who she really is," he said, pointing at Karen. "A fraud, a thief, and a bully. And tonight her reign ends." Karen tried to fight back, but it was too late. The community had seen the truth, and they weren't going to let her get away with it. A vote was called, and with overwhelming support, Karen was voted out of her position as HOA president. The protagonist stood there, watching as the woman who had terrorized his family for so long was finally brought down. The suspense had been unbearable, but now it was over. Karen had lost and the community had won. After everything that had happened, the protagonist's family finally felt a weight lift from their shoulders. The constant fear, the bullying, the harassment from Karen and her family, it was all over. For the first time in what felt like forever, they could breathe. Emma, his daughter, was no longer afraid to leave her house, no longer worried that she would be humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood. She was free. Karen's manipulative grip on the community had been shattered, and now the protagonist and his family could finally reclaim their peace. As soon as Karen was ousted from the HOA, the neighborhood seemed to change overnight. The atmosphere felt lighter. People who had once been afraid to speak up now stood tall, openly supporting the protagonist's family. It was as if the entire neighborhood had been held hostage by Karen's lies and control, but now that she was gone, they could finally breathe easy too. Neighbors who had once avoided the protagonist and his family, afraid of Karen's influence, came forward to offer their apologies and their support. The once divided community began to unite, realizing that standing up against Karen had been the right thing to do. They saw the injustice that Emma had endured and understood that the family's battle was not just about one woman's bullying, but about reclaiming the neighborhood from someone who had used fear and manipulation to control everyone. The protagonist, still holding on to his calm and steady demeanor, felt a sense of justice, but it was more than just about Karen's downfall. It was about showing his daughter, Emma, that no matter how difficult life got, standing up for what was right would always be worth it. He had spent years teaching his daughter how to be strong, how to face the world with dignity, and now for the first time he saw her truly believing in herself again. As the family prepared to leave the neighborhood, their home of many years, the final scene felt almost like a victory. Emma rolled her wheelchair slowly down the driveway, her parents walking beside her. The entire neighborhood gathered at the end of the street, watching silently. People who had once feared Karen now stood proudly, showing their support for the family as they left. For Emma, the sight of the neighborhood standing with her, her strength and her family, was something she would never forget. As she glanced over her shoulder at the people gathered to say goodbye, a small but proud smile formed on her face. For the first time, Emma felt like she had truly won. Her family had taken down the monster who had tormented her, and in the process she had learned the most important lesson of all: she was stronger than anyone had ever realized. With one final look at the neighborhood they had once feared, the family got in the car and drove away. Karen's reign of terror had ended, and the family knew they were leaving behind more than just a house. They were leaving behind the pain and the fear, and taking with them a newfound sense of justice and peace.